Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting for February 2021. Although this is a virtual meeting, it's still a formal meeting of Hackney Council, and all the usual constitutional requirements of council meetings apply. I would like to also remind members and officers present that this meeting is being held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting will continue to apply, and media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. Just a few points to remember in terms of operability. Unless you are speaking, please keep your mic muted. If you'd like to speak, raise your hand or indicate in the chat section to get my attention. Keeping your camera on helps me to identify who would like to speak. Thank you for your patience, and let's start the meeting. I'll start with item 1, apologies for absence. Do I have any apologies for absence or lateness?
Justine MacDonald has given her apologies, and Councillor Potter will be late to the meeting at 8 o'clock.
Okay, thank you very much. Then moving on to item 2, urgent items. There are no urgent items and the agenda is as published. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest? I'd like to start by saying that I work for Just for Kids Law. Do we have any others? Councillor Peters?
I'm Mayor Governor of the Garden School in Hackney.
Councillor Shorhan?
I'm an NEU member and also a teacher.
Joe?
I'm a governor at Thomas Abney Primary School in Hackney.
Shabnam?
Current governor at Benthall Primary School.
Right, is that it? Do we have any others? No? Okay. Great. Now moving on to item 4, which is our first and only substantive item for this evening's meeting, and that's the attainment gap. The Commission maintains oversight of the academic attainment of children across Hackney and receives updates on pupil achievement each year. Given persisting disparities in educational achievement among different cohorts of young people, the Commission agreed to dedicate a future meeting to further scrutinise the attainment gap in particular, as this affects local Black, Caribbean and other Black or minority ethnic communities. Quite specifically for Hackney, we're talking about Turkish, Kurdish and to other Turkish-speaking children. And it's important for me to point out at this point that we've decided to focus this attainment gap section of this meeting on the attainment gap, quite specifically on these ethnic groups. And that is not to say that we don't recognise or take issue with the attainment gap that persists for other groups, including children with special educational needs and disabilities, as well as looked after children and children on free school meals. We just appreciate that we're limited for time and that we probably ought to give these other areas the time that they deserve at another meeting. So tonight's session will provide an opportunity to review national data and trends in the attainment gap, consider how the attainment gap disproportionately affects Black, Caribbean and other minority ethnic groups, assess how those strategies which help to close the attainment gap with Black, Caribbean and other minority ethnic communities, identify what further action the authority can take to support schools to close the attainment gap. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our external guests this evening. Thank you for coming along and for kindly agreeing to assist the Commission in its work this evening. The session will outline timings. The session outline and timings are all set out in the agenda front sheet. The session is structured so that all our guests have an opportunity to speak and to highlight the key issues first, then we can go into more detailed question and answer thereafter. As you can see, we have a tight schedule, so please can you keep to the allotted time so that we have the opportunity to explore issues in greater detail in the question and answers. So we're going to start with a national overview and evidence, and we'll start with Mary Reader, the senior researcher at the Education Policy Institute, please. You have about 10 minutes if you can cover in 10 minutes, please.
Great, thanks very much, Councillor Conway. Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be giving evidence. What I'm going to do is give a national overview of the most recent research from the Education Policy Institute, where I work, on both the disadvantage gap by free school meals, but also at ethnicity gaps. over the last decade. So every year at EPI, we report on the attainment gap at national and regional level, from the early years to primary school to secondary school. And you can find detailed breakdowns on our website, but I'll take out the key trends for you here. And what we found this year, we think is of real cause for concern. So at national level, for the first time in at least a decade, the disadvantage gap, so the average difference between the attainment of children on free school meals and children who are not, has stopped closing. So according to the latest pupil level data in 2019, by the time they sit their GCSEs, free school meals children are 18.1 months behind their peers in terms of learning and development. And that gap has stayed the same over the last 5 years, which we think is really worrying. And meanwhile, we find that the gap is about 9.6 months at primary school and 4.6 months in the early years. So clearly these gaps get wider as children get older. We did some analysis also of what might be driving these gaps, which I'll keep relatively brief. But the conclusion is that what might be driving this is trends in persistent poverty and disadvantage, which we define as pupils who are eligible for free school meals for 80% or more of their school lives. So when we look at outcomes for disadvantaged pupils by how persistently poor they are, a really clear picture emerges. So for persistently disadvantaged pupils who have a gap twice the size of regular disadvantaged pupils, they've seen their gap worsen in every single year but one, apart from in the last 5 years, since 2014. And therefore their gap has increased by a net 0.5% over this period. So we think this is really worrying because it shows that what's going on with the national disadvantage gap is it being driven in part by what's happening to our most persistently disadvantaged pupils. I know that the Commission has a particular interest in ethnicity, so I'm going to kind of shorten my evidence on disadvantage and try and focus on that. So we also, for the first time this year, have published analysis of attainment gaps by ethnicity in every year since 2011. And there are some really interesting findings from doing that analysis. So as of 2019, we find that there were really significant inequalities by ethnicity, which will come as no surprise. For Gypsy Roma pupils, they see the largest attainment gap of nearly 3 years by the time they sit their GCSEs. And for Black Caribbean pupils, that gap is 11 months. Travellers of Irish heritage also have a very large gap of 2 years at secondary school level, that is as well. And white and Black Caribbean pupils have a gap of around 7 months, as do other Black pupils. And it's worth noting that all of those gaps we measure relative to white British pupils, who are the majority ethnicity in the UK at national level. We also look at outcomes for pupils who have English as an additional language but arrive relatively late into the English state school system, because we know from the literature that these are the pupils that tend to struggle the most academically. And our analysis shows that outcomes and the gap for those pupils is 21 months at secondary school. There are also, of course, some ethnic groups that on average do better than white British pupils, but for the most part, the thing we're concerned about is the pupils who fall behind. So that's why we've focused on that, but you'll find a full breakdown on the EPI website. So the key bit here that we think is really interesting is what's happened over time. And since 2011, there's some really worrying evidence about how outcomes for Black children in particular have really worsened. For Black Caribbean pupils at national level, their gap has widened by 68% since 2011. Really quite shocking. And for other Black pupils, it's widened by 77%. Meanwhile, for late arriving EAL pupils, which I just mentioned, the gap has also widened by 11%. So that's all over the period from 2011 to 2019. And we think this presents an extremely worrying picture at national level of what's happening to educational inequalities, both in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage, as I sketched at the beginning, but also particularly in relation to ethnicity, a topic which has become to like national prominence this year, but it's clearly something that has underlying causes and needs to be addressed in a more long-term sense. And we think that's a very relevant picture for Hackney, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the more local evidence, as we know that Hackney has both a high proportion of disadvantaged pupils, but also a high proportion of ethnic minorities. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing from everybody else. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Mary. Really, really appreciate you attending this evening and your presentation. I'd just like to take this opportunity actually to ask Councillor Bramble if she would like to declare an interest in light of a comment that she made.
Yes, Chair. I just recently had been invited to be one of the advisors to the National Policy Institute Chair. So while I formally accepted their invitation, I haven't officially started. So it was remiss of me not to mention that as a declaration of interest.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bramble. Now I'd like to move on to Professor Demie from the School of Education, Durham University. Thank you very much for coming. Now handing over to you.
You need to unblock yourself, Professor Demie. You're still on mute.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. Although I'm honorary professor at University of Durham, I also work Lambeth education. I've been working for a long time on Black Caribbean issue. What I'm really going to do today is I want to really share my own experience in terms of research of a long time with Black Caribbean children, starting to 2002 when we published first about Black Caribbean achievement. I would argue today the hardest question that faces most policymakers, councillors, schools is not raising achievement. It's easy to raise achievement. It is how to close the gap and address inequality in school and in local area. Well, I'll try to answer 4 questions during this session. What does the national data tell us about achievement of Black Caribbean people? I'll be talking in terms of key stage 2 achievement and GCSE achievement gap. What is the reason behind from my own research? I think Mary nicely said about poverty. I probably don't want to go much into poverty. I'll really talk about other things, what came out of my own research. The other thing is, it's never been doom and gloom. It's always possible to raise achievement of Black Caribbean children, and we do have good evidence if we really wanted to do it. So I'll talk about what can be done to close the achievement gap. Really, closing the gap of achievement of Black Caribbean children and their peers is the highest challenge we faced in England the last 60 years. Evidence from research now show the English education system has produced dismissal academic result for high percentage of Black Caribbean people. I'll really go back to 16 years, 40 years if you really wanted to do. Over the past 4 decades, national research has shown that achievement persistently lag behind the average achievement of their peers, which I'm really talking about here is white British, and you can compare with other ethnic groups, both at primary and secondary level. A key find of analysis, which I really did for 2019, actually suggests about 42% of Black Caribbean people achieve 5A to C compared to 60% of white British, which is really, really a big gap, which you could see there. More importantly, if you really want to compare with us, an ethnic group, also Black Caribbean, about 61% achieve 5A2C, including English and Math, 60% Bangladeshi, and 77% Indian, 86% Chinese, really in terms of national statistic. Black Caribbean are consistently the lowest performing group at the bottom, whatever ethnic group we say, except Gypsy and really Roma, which are very small in terms of statistical comparison. A number of research have now also argued that little or no headway in closing achievement gap, which is a place where my Education Policy Institute really conclusions. Closing the disadvantage gap will take really a century, actually, they said. My argument is it may not take a century. If you really have good targeting intervention, it's really possible to really narrow those gaps. The UK research suggests that Black face a number of problems in English education system, but the current government national policy, as far as I'm concerned, I say in many places, is really color blind. They're not really interested in anything about ethnic minorities. The education policy does not mention the issue of race. Ethnicity inequality in England has ignored addressing the need of underachieving ethnic group in British school. There is no longer ring-fenced funding or EMAG, which we have until 2010 in terms of raising achievement of ethnic minority children, where you used to get about 210 million money per year, I'm really talking about, and also about 80 million money was allocated to London Challenge, which have made huge difference in London. And more importantly, there was also 6 million money which was allocated in terms of raising achievement Black Caribbean children. Those money and all those funding have been abolished in 2010. So it's no surprise they are underachieving, but I will tell you the reason why they are underachieving. My research suggests there are a number of issues and really factors. The first one is institutional racism have really affected a lot of Black Caribbean children in school. You need to read my research report if you really want to go into detail. The other thing is, particularly outside of London, when Black Caribbean children come, there is head teacher poor leadership on equality issue. You may not find this issue in London. You can really challenge them outside of London if you really go and really talk, and that's really what you see. There is also teacher low expectation, particularly about this group. There are curriculum barriers, lack of representation in terms of real history, and there are also a diversity workforce issue. 91% of school leaders are white British. 86% of teachers are white teachers. 87% of TAs are also white British. So you could see the challenge you really face, particularly when you start talking across England. There is also lack of targeted intervention. No national strategies, no sure start. There is also ability grouping problem, or a low inter issue, where Black Caribbean are really overrepresented. However, I could really say, I will repeat my word again, it is not always doom and gloom, it can be done. My own research actually show from case study of 14 schools suggests you can, Black Caribbean children actually do very well. Those schools were at one point were on a special measure and now are outstanding or really good school. One of the factors, the key factor we really found was an head teacher excellent leadership on diversity issues and on equality issue. What is Ofsted actually said about those schools are 70 of the leadership are outstanding. And only about 25 are really good, which actually means is really these kids are going in good and outstanding school. There is effective teaching and learning in those school. 71 of of the teaching in those schools are really outstanding. Inclusive curriculum is well used, the very strong link with the community, and also there is diversity in workforce. You'll be very surprised in the case study school I have done, 60% of BME are BME staff. And more importantly, at head teacher level, in one school, 60% of the staff are Black Caribbean origin, with head teacher actually herself is a Black Caribbean background, who transformed the school from 8% 5A to C into 79% 5, including English and math, in short period of time. There is also effective targeting intervention on those schools. Overall, my conclusion is in good school, Black Caribbean people do well, but mainly in multicultural school where I did a relay case study. Is it only this research which shows this one? No. There are many other research actually show you can narrow a gap. Let's go back to national strategies. Some time ago, when we invested 80 million in London Challenge, 210 million on impact per year on Black Caribbean children. What they did during that time was they used effective Black teachers who go around the country who will particularly help some schools. They use effective small group support, personal tutoring, and booster class and pastoral care. In 2004, the gap was about 90%, but within a short period of time, by 2013, the money to narrow the gap into 8%. If you really look now, the gap has gone up nearly the same where we were in 2006 because there is no investment in supporting in this area. I'm now really concluding and saying, I would say it's a big challenge in terms of closing the gap. We must be prepared to tackle this issue. I would argue that it takes one range of strategy with a strong lead from national government to reverse the trend of underachievement, particularly Black Caribbean people. Simply, local authority cannot do on their own. What is needed is funding, investment, support school to raise achievement from national government. This is really, really key. My recommendation with the research are there is a need of recognition of the importance of cultural, ethnic, linguistic diversity in England. DFE should provide ring-fenced funding, EMAC funding, and to support Black Caribbean children. I would really argue with the need to reinstate EMAC funding in order to support these children. More importantly, I will argue again, they all talk about disadvantaged children or same children at the national level at the moment. There is a need of establishing a national Black Caribbean achievement project. It shouldn't be local only. It should be nationally funded. Also, we need to develop a curriculum, a workforce that reflect the UK rich cultural diversity. These are really key in terms of really closing the gap. Thank you really very much for listening to me. I will stop here as an introduction. Happy to take questions in the really later period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you both, Mary and Dr. Demie, for sticking to, Professor Demie, sorry, for sticking to 10 minutes, you're allotted 10 minutes. Now we're going to hand over to our officers for a sort of local context. So I'm going to hand over to Annie Gammon, Stephen Ball, and we have Pauline Badu joining us this evening as well. So Annie Gammon is the Director of Education for the London Borough of Hackney. Stephen Hall is the Assistant Director of Learning and Achievement at London Borough of Hackney, and Pauline Badu is our System Lead for the Young Black Men's Project in Hackney. So handing over to, I'm not sure which of you would like to speak. We've got 10 minutes, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a couple of words, Councillor Conway and guests, and just say that Anton Franchek, our secondary principal advisor, will also speak to this. So I'm going to speak and then hand over to Stephen and then Anton who'll talk, and then I think Orleen will come in. And really, I'm not going to say very much, except I think that sometimes in the discussion of what we are talking about in education is complex. Schools are complex places, and some of the things we talk about are to do with teaching and learning in the curriculum, and we want those absolutely to be as good as possible for every child. And then some of the things we talk about are about the culture and ethos and inclusivity of the school, and we want those to be as good as possible for every child. And as our speakers have said, we want to really want to include everybody. I think where we get the best possible outcomes for all ethnic groups, both those things come together. And I know colleagues who are going to speak, both from the council and our head teacher colleagues, will speak about that. I think the other thing of interest is what schools can do, in the sense of being fairly autonomous institutions, but also how we influence them both locally and as the professor said, nationally, is of interest, I think, and it would be interesting to hear head teachers touch on that as well. But I'm going to hand over to Stephen Hall, who's Assistant Director in charge of School Improvement, to give us the local picture.
Thank you, Annie. Good evening, everyone. I think you'll see from the paper that's been submitted that overall Hackney schools perform favourably against national averages and have done for a period of time. However, those gaps still persist, and as was mentioned earlier, in particular for Turkish, Kurdish, Cypriot pupils, and also Black Caribbean boys and Black Caribbean pupils. However, we have a number of success stories within Hackney, and the differences are quite often within a school in terms of particular groups, and finding trends and themes, as you can see, is a fairly complex beast. And as Annie said, the work we are doing is really to support schools in what they're doing, because they're the key agency here, and they're the ones who are really making the difference. And it's the aspiration of the school and the effectiveness of the teacher that really drives those gaps down. Our work is underpinned by a policy, the Good to Great policy, and that outlines a graduated support for schools. So where schools are performing well, they have light touch intervention, and where they're performing less well, where there's concerns, then they get much more intervention and much more support. And it really is about supporting the school to improve itself. We can't improve it for it. It has to be coming from the ground up. But we have a linked school improvement partner for each school, they're all experienced head teachers. They've all taught in inner city communities, and they understand the particular challenges and context of working in Hackney, and the many joys and benefits of working in Hackney. So we have some specific programs aimed at Turkish, Kurdish and Black Caribbean pupils to raise their attainment. Those are aimed at both the pupil level, but train the trainer, supporting schools to deliver programs, supporting schools to deliver programs for parents and staff, as well as pupils. And you had Orleen's name mentioned earlier. Orleen's our systems leader, who leads on a lot of our unconscious bias training. And we've done a lot of work also on our ensuring we've got a representative curriculum and supporting schools with their work. Obviously, we don't set the curriculum, but certainly just by asking the questions and supporting and exploring how the curriculum can be orientated to better meet the needs of its pupils and be representative has been a real focus. And we have produced curriculum materials that support that too. And that goes from the curriculum drafting itself right through to the texts that are being used, and through to the textbooks and learning materials that are being used. We know that the gaps persist from a very young age, and quite often particularly disadvantaged pupils come in, and it's a well-documented issue of that language deficit and that lack of encouragement sometimes from home, or that lack of knowledge from home, that lack of reading culture from home, which is why that early education is so important, and getting children into our outstanding nursery schools is key to getting that great start. But we also know that teacher expertise in teaching of subjects like reading in primary can be problematic. It's quite a complex thing to teach very well. And so we certainly have some very effective programs that support teachers with that, and some great consultants who work not just in Hackney, but more broadly to support with that as well. I mentioned about the unconscious bias and the concerns about the bias that teachers bring, and really, and adults bring. And I think really working in a diverse community, such as Professor Demie spoke about earlier, really is a benefit to Hackney, to London schools and Hackney schools. Alongside the school leaders just having that high aspiration and that can-do approach. And I think we benefit from a number of strong leaders who just believe that all children can achieve and just won't accept no for an answer. And where we see that failing is where leaders stop believing that and start believing that actually there's some children who can't get there, or young people who can't get there. In effective schools, we also see that high quality coaching and training for staff. Teaching is an art. It's a very difficult skill to adopt. It takes years to learn to do it very well. There are some people who are naturally very adept at it, but even the greatest teachers learn their trade and crafted their trade over time. So effective schools then train and develop their staff to do that. They also use this assessment very, very effectively. So they're tracking individual children, they're tracking groups of children and young people and identifying where those weaknesses are. And then doing something about it. So finding those gaps already early on, and then dealing with it and putting things in place to support. And also organising the curriculum to make sure those building blocks are there along the way. Engaging those parents and carers, making sure that home learning process is understood, but also supporting parents and carers with home learning. And we've seen many of our schools doing that very, very effectively in terms of providing those materials. And that's really come to the fore, obviously, in the last year, since pupils have been learning remotely more than they've been learning face-to-face. And around that is that opportunity to learn about the world around those additional enrichment opportunities, and a real language-rich curriculum and culturally rich curriculum, which again Professor Demie mentioned earlier, as just being something that gives that aspiration but also that life chance. I'm going to hand over to Anton to talk briefly about the post-16 as well.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Professor Demie, for your outline there, because we kind of very much agree with you on those themes about leadership, culture, capacity. At post-16, as you know, we've got 12 schools have sixth forms with the main offer of A-levels. Some are offering level 3, and we also have a college. Our outcomes show a small change. The average point score for A-level on entry went up. The national average went up slightly. Last year, we saw bigger rises locally than we're seeing nationally, and it was the same with Key Stage 4 with GCSE. So we're pleased with that, even though last year that the grades were subject to the algorithm and so forth. But we're working with schools, we're working with the institutional leaders and subject leaders at addressing bias. For example, we wrote a piece with Orleen on teacher bias, which was received very well. In terms of destinations at post-16, 45% of our disadvantaged cohort went on to higher education. Nationally, it was 59%. 62% of our disadvantaged remain in study or in education, and we're really pleased that a lot of our schools and colleges are working together and addressing at post-16 the tension between entry requirements and also ensuring a diverse provision. Common across the ground, and it's been sharpened in the past year, has been working through our subject networks, through those fora, at developing practice, at exchanging curriculum practice, curriculum intent. We're pleased to see that inroads are being made, and certainly at post-16, the story for the Caribbean learner is a successful one in that they've outperformed their national peers. So we've got some gains there that we celebrate. That's where I'm going to end, because I'm just conscious that we're going to run out of time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anton. And I wondered, Orleen, if you would like to touch on some of the strands of the work you've been leading on.
Thank you, Annie, and good evening. I think there's a I'd like to start by saying there's a book that I've read about how to be anti-racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and it's quite an interesting text because it talks about the fact that we can't wait to change people's hearts and minds. It's about policy and it's about practice, and I think that's a lot of what's happening in Hackney. It's not just about doing the right thing, but it's actually put in practice guidance to support schools, and a lot of the work that I do, I'm happy, you know, when I talk to schools, it's definitely something that all schools are addressing, and I've spoken to most of our secondary schools in Hackney as a result, and many of our primaries as well. So I have finished leading on curating the curriculum documents, which are available online. I think we're at the point now where, in a meeting recently, Councillor Bramble and I, they said that 591 schools have engaged with the units of work from Hackney and beyond. And I think the units of work do two things. One thing that they do is kind of provide a model of how to do it, to ensure that Black children, and actually this work, the research says once you do it for one group, it actually, what you'll find is that schools then will start to think about other groups that are reflected in their school. So not only does it provide a model that's been done by teachers, which I think is key, that it's done by teachers, but also it provides a model of how to do that curriculum development yourself as a school and to take that forward. As Anton said, there has been guidance around bias in assessment, and I think that that's key again this year, as we wait to hear how the government decides that assessments are done. I think there's been a huge amount of work about engaging parent voice and developing pupil voice, and kind of ensuring that we're hearing from the community about kind of best next steps and best feet forward. And so there's lots that's on the go. There's audits that are done with schools, lots of discussion, schools often contacting me for support as well. So there's a huge appetite from schools in Hackney to close the gaps.
Thank you very much, Annie, Stephen and Orleen. Now I think we're going to move on to comparative analysis and assessment, and I'd like to invite James Page, the Chief Executive of Haringey Education Partnership, to speak. You've got about 5 minutes, if that's okay, James.
Great, thank you so much, Chair. This will be enormously truncated to fit in those 5 minutes, so forgive me for anything that is overly so. First thing, I come at this very much with humility. Whereas being a white middle class male, you know, pronouncing on gaps in achievement, and also just that I say this to all of our schools, it can be really uncomfortable talking not just about disadvantage, which is almost an external thing that affects whether children can achieve, but ethnicity and identity, which is so fundamental, you know, to every child and community. It's also something that's obviously systemic and historic. It's bigger than any one school. It's bigger than any one thing. This is international in scope. You know, and we know that our Black Caribbean results have barely shifted in 70 years, you know, in the country. So, you know, clearly there's a lot going on. You know, Mary reflected that, you know, some of those things haven't shifted for a long time. So the question is it just more interventions? Is it kind of, you know, we just need, you know, to take the EFF, you know, policy toolkit and just do the best interventions more with those gaps? And there's a place for that, but I don't think it's the whole answer. I think fundamentally we need to understand each community and its history, you know, and that kind of cultural literacy is really at the root of it. You know, understanding the position of the Black Caribbean community coming to the UK, whether it's from what we call the Windrush generation, the racism that was faced, leaving the children behind in the Caribbean, then their place in school, all of those have shaped, you know, a set of perceptions and everything else, both amongst community of schools and society, but also of schools of the society, if you see what I mean. You know, and so I think that understanding of culture in schools and perceptions and biases is really intangible but fundamental to what is really, really important here. So in Haringey, we have a very low disadvantage gap overall. So we do well by our disadvantaged pupils compared to London or national, but we've got the biggest gap at GCSE between white British and Black Caribbean in the country. That's partly because our white British are really off the chart. We don't have the low achieving, more working class white British cohort really very strongly. But it's still, you know, our outcomes for our Black Caribbean learners are poor, and they're not where they need to be, even close. And it isn't, you know, I'm glad that you referenced the Turkish Kurdish community as well. You know, at Key Stage 2, we have 51% of our Turkish community achieving the expected standard in reading. That's compared to 90% of our white British. So the gaps are enormous. You know, it's a different story for Black African, who we also focus on, with higher attainment, but rarely greater depth at Key Stage 2, and still below at GCSE just, but still face bias and exclusions, you know, to a large degree. There's a, I think there's a brilliant Fisher Family Trust blog from Mike Treadaway on, they've looked over time at ethnicity by EAL, non-EAL, and long-term disadvantage, and where those vulnerabilities lie with specific communities, which include white British. I think that's worth, you know, that intersectionality is worth looking at. But so just briefly in Haringey, what have we been up to? Well, we came to this 4 years ago. We were looking at that gap at GCSE, which was absolutely shocking. We looked at the data extensively. We actually didn't find any correlation in our schools between whether those communities were smaller or larger as a percentage of the school cohort. So I don't know if there's anything useful in that or not. And we had an initial conference with some tools. We created a self-audit tool of a vulnerable to underachievement checklist, and tried to get everyone focused on this. We've continued to do that. I think one of the most valuable things we've got in Haringey is a really strong steering group for Haringey Education Partnership, the council, heads and governors, who have no formal authority but work together to lead on behalf of the borough and reach out to all of the schools across the borough on the agenda. So we've developed a whole lot of tools, research, resources that we've put on the website. We have been doing a bit of work but need to do more on pupil voice. And the things that I would stress that came through pupil voice really were the self-image and self-identity of young people that is created from such an early age, with the images you see in the media across society about what is expected of young black men in particular, but also the nature of relationships at school and the importance of that soft side of things and how important that was too. We developed a pledge that every single one of the Haringey schools has signed. It has 8 commitments in it, which are quite far-reaching. They include things like having an SLT champion, having a lead governor on the subject, having the issue in your school improvement plan, reporting regularly on it, having those conversations with parents, setting high expectations, all of those pieces of work. And then the steering group is really focused on a number of areas. I won't go through them all, but we've wanted to, where it's been kind of consensual so far and just kind of hoping schools use the tools that we've created, adding teeth to that with really kind of in-depth data reviews, using our improvement partners to go into school and follow up on what's happening in school. What we call support for difficult conversations. So there we do free introductory training in each school. We offer a BAME review for each school for half a day. And I also lead networks of those SLT champions and lead governors as well. We're picking up a piece of work on parental engagement. This is only at the very outset, but working with the Parental Engagement Network. We are doing work on the curriculum. I think this is as much though about building a knowledge-rich curriculum and making sure that children have those, all the children have those fundamentals in place of, you know, the sort of schemata of knowledge that they need to succeed, as well as looking at its diversity and representation, which is crucial too. CPD and training's ongoing, you won't be surprised to hear. We're looking at additional support around a Saturday school for our black children who are not special educational needs, but are starting to see a gap in year 4 and in year 7, and we'll roll that forward. And we're looking at mentoring opportunities in secondary with very specific programs to help with access to HE. Exclusions have been a real issue, and we're looking at that. We continue with the conferences because we find them immensely motivating amongst schools. and keeping the pressure up. And then it's been great working with Annie, Stephen, Anton, and others, and Fazer as well across London. So with Lambeth, they've been doing some fantastic work. Brent and Hackney and ourselves doing lots of work on this issue. And just if I can just end on, I was really surprised about, must be a year ago now, no more, year and a half ago, that, presenting to the London Strategic Leads Network for schools, I was just astonished by how few boroughs outside of the ones I've just mentioned felt that this was a topic they could address or talk about, and actually needing permission to be able to say this really matters. It's not just disadvantage and we've got to tackle it. So I think we need to build that whole agenda. Like I said at the start, this is systemic, historic, and the more of us who do it together and raise the profile, the stronger I think we'll be.
Thank you very much for that, James. Now we're going to hand over to our schools and nurseries in the borough. I'd like to start with Lisa Clarke, head teacher of Comet Children's Centre and Nursery, please.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I'm just going to, because early years is such a minefield, I'm just going to say that we're a nursery school and a children's centre. So we are a nursery school staffed with teachers and nursery education officers. And I thought I'd start by kind of giving you a bit of a flavour of who we are and what we do. So we've got 120 children on roll in our nursery school. And we have a 2-year-old provision, which we opened in 2015. And those 2-year-olds are all funded 2-year-olds. So they're all classed, I suppose, as disadvantaged children. So that is open from 2015. We've got 27 different languages spoken at Comet. So obviously you can see the spread that we have in our provision. 10% of our children are from the Turkish, Kurdish speaking community, and we have only 3% of Black Caribbean children. But obviously when we're looking at the children that we have in our community, those 3% are as important as any other percent. They just don't constitute our biggest group, which our actual biggest group is our Turkish speaking community. We are an inclusive nursery school, and we have 25% of our children have additional needs. So that just kind of shows you the way that the makeup of our nursery is. And actually we have been really lucky enough to do the training with Orleen around the unconscious bias. Sadly I wasn't there that day because I was self-isolating, but we had that unconscious bias training, and I know that the staff found it hugely important and interesting, and they'd certainly been inspired by a lot of the Black Lives Matters movement that has happened in the summer, and it was kind of a way for us to move forward into really thinking more deeply about the unconscious bias that clearly, is part of, of us understanding who we are and what we come with as a staff. And it certainly raised the awareness. And one of the things that we've gone on to do is to make a sort of a library of books that for adults that we can go away and think about what we're doing. We know that children come to the nursery and they're already showing that there is a gap that emerges in early years, and we are really quite attuned to that. We know that there are inequalities in ethnicity, in socio-economic factors, and the disadvantage that comes with the children that come into our nursery school. We are also mindful of that in the children's centre as well, because a lot of the work that we do is around families. It's not just around those children, it's around families and how we can support our families both within the children's centre and the nursery school in making those differences for their children. We know when we do our home visits at the beginning of the year, we get to see kind of the lives that people live in terms of possible poor housing and what that sort of brings with it. And it's not about us going and looking at children's families' houses, but actually getting a sense of who those children and those families are. We do see what's the core of what we do is around children's self-esteem and identity, and there is a huge sort of intersectionality around the children that we get to see at the nursery school and how we support those children. And when we're looking at our Turkish-speaking children, we know that that group often comes in with a lower attainment on entry, and we're really mindful of that and about and looking at how that impacts on their learning throughout the nursery. And we certainly are aware of that through our sort of our tracking system, about looking at those, particularly at our Turkish speaking community, about their development, and it is particularly around that communication and language. And often those children come in with less English, but it's also about how we guide them, you know, through early education in being able to support them. And I know that when I've done some research with our Turkish-speaking families, and a lot of where they're coming from is saying that actually at home, you know, they're watching Turkish TV, you know, that they really are quite a community. And so when they come to us, they don't often have that English. So, you know, it's starting off to learn English. In terms of our Black Caribbean group of children, it is a small group, but we know that those children go on to schools, and so, you know, and they become part of possibly a bigger group. And we are particularly mindful of the work that we're doing with boys in particular. And looking at is there a way in which that we can support those groups of children. And a lot of what we do, if it's we're looking at disadvantage, is working with our children that are entitled to early years pupil premium. And we've done a lot of work around that, and our natural explorers. And this seems to have been something that has really narrowed the gap for our disadvantaged children, whichever ethnicity that they come from. And a lot of what we're doing is looking at the funds of knowledge of those children. We're looking at the cultural capital of those children and the lived experiences of those children, because being able to gain a better understanding of that identity allows us to support more the children as well as the families. And we've been looking at ways in which we can do that through parental engagement and through the work of our staff. And we're lucky enough to have 2 Turkish-speaking members of staff who were able to really support our families in understanding and getting you know, a sense of what early education is around. We do know that when we've looked at communication and language for our children that are coming into nursery, that often is a low starting point for some of our children. And so our Natural Explorers project that we've been doing around when we're allowed to, taking children out into the community and doing often some really exciting trips, which might be to restaurants to order your food, to cafes. It might be to museums, it might be just around the block to buy your shopping, to make your cakes. All of those kinds of things are really developing our communication and language for our young children. So I suppose, just sort of finishing off and being mindful of the time, I think, you know, we have seen with the restrictions around the lockdown, the sort of digital inequalities that we have for our families on low incomes, and I think that's a real issue at the moment around thinking about how we support families in being able to get online and to follow our home learning that we've been doing on our website. But also we've put a lot of work into our Facebook and our social media in terms of Instagram, being able to get information out to families quite quickly through social media. but we hope that that all of the work that we've been doing at the moment in terms of home learning and encouraging families to be part of that community will really stand them in good stead for narrowing that gap, both when we're at nursery and when we're in the environment, to actually what we're being able to do with our home learning at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'd now like to hand over to Nicole Reid, the Executive Head Teacher at New Wave Federation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Stephen, for inviting me tonight to talk to everyone about this really important issue that no doubt the current situation has exacerbated as well. As school leaders, and being the executive head teacher of 3 primary schools in Hackney, we have a very clear understanding that good teaching is the most important lever, as Stephen mentioned, to improve the outcome of all pupils, especially our disadvantaged children. And that's very, very clear to us from the onset. What I want to talk to you tonight about is around 3 broad headlines and how, as a federation, we have thought about what are the possible strategies that we are going to employ to address some of these barriers. And one of the key things, if we take teaching first, is growing our own teachers. And what we're very keen on is ensuring that we place our teachers in a classroom alongside very supportive and very knowledgeable mentors who are able to demonstrate daily outstanding practice, which will make a difference to our children. As a result of that, what we have been able to do is to develop a very clear set of expected teaching behaviours that are practiced and developed so that our children become experienced, consistent and stable learners, and that is at the heart of what we do. We also know that one size does not fit all in terms of the professional development that we design for our staff, and we provide very different and clear pathways in individualized teaching journeys for those members of staff. One of the things that we have used, and I think Lisa, my colleague, has mentioned, that is the use of technology and how we embed that in our curriculum and link it to the needs of the teachers, regardless of the experience that they have. And always creating connections with professionals so that we are open and we are aware of the best practice out there, which we reflect on and use to refine and improve the practice that we offer our children in light of the new knowledge that we have learned. And making sure that we have a very strong ethos across the Federation, that we are all lifelong learners, and we're equipping our leaders and our staff with identifying the knowledge that the teachers need in each of the subject area. If I talked about a little bit about our curriculum or environment that we provide our children, is to create that positive and supportive environment for all pupils without exception, driven by our core values, what we try to achieve: excellence for all. And as I mentioned earlier, is about the expected learning behaviours by all, including families, and providing that consistency and that sense of security and stability for all the pupils that we have in our schools, especially our most vulnerable children. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of, and something that are very, very close to me, is around our curriculum design. About 2 years ago, we designed this project around Knowing Me Before You Teach Me project, where the staff were trained to develop a curriculum that then get to know their children before they teach them, having an understanding, and really developing that culture around we accommodate certain behaviour, but we don't tolerate certain behaviour, and really develop a system of where there's strong empathy for the children so that they can be successful in school. Celebrating where everyone comes from and who everyone is, and our curriculum is very representative of our school community. All staff know the headlines on the research that we've heard today and the outcomes for disadvantaged pupils, but not just our disadvantaged children, but for other learners. And where there is evidence across the school, staff are given, they are very driven to reverse that negative trend. So if something that is emerging earlier on across the school, staff are very driven that it's their role to reverse this negative trend and take on board the new learning that they have acquired. We have a clear understanding that disadvantage is not one category, and knowing your children and understanding and the influences that they have and how to manage that directly or indirectly, considering the context that they live in. All of the staff across the 3 schools, they have, own their year group data, their class data, and they are set achievable goals that will help to close those gaps and set a time frame in which those are achieved. I know Stephen mentioned about coaching and professional development for staff, and that is triangulated through the support of developing staff knowledge and skills around closing the gaps. For us, learning steps are clear and are very succinct and are broken down into chunks which are modelled and practiced daily to support independence learning. We also build on this recall knowledge and recall on the prior knowledge of all pupils and support those children with the limited life experiences to make links in their own lives and other areas of learning. And part of our ethos, again, is valuing all experiences. One of the things that we're very, very proud of is that we put reading at the heart of our curriculum, so that we know that children who are able to read will be able to access the rest of the curriculum, and loving reading will also ensure that we improve the children's health and mental well-being, giving them that wider references to life experiences that they may not able to experience, and as a result of that, it will improve their life chances. One of the key things we talked about was to build in a background for each of the topic within our curriculum and support pupils to make those connections and build that strong mental models over time. The other aspect which I'll talk to you about is that targeted approach to the needs of the individual children, and we start very early around in the EYFS and really focusing on communication and language, and really be very clear about that sequential vocabulary development and ensuring that children are given the vocabulary that are selected for the provision that they are in to allow that interaction to occur and for the vocabulary to use daily. We have that one-to-one tutoring skills going on, so where we tutor the children to develop those core skills around talk and phonics and place value, to ensure that when they get to Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2, they have a really strong foundation to follow. I guess the question that we'll ask is constantly, what else can the council do in order to ensure that we narrow the gap? And I guess is having these conversations and making use of the data that's available and holding schools to account to make sure that they're aware of the gaps, and it's part of the conversation that they're having at all levels. I know I've really raced through that, so I'll be sticking around for the discussion part, so if anybody's got any question about any of the particular points I've raised, then please do raise them with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And now handing over to Anna Feltham, the head teacher of Clapton Girls Academy.
Hello, hi everyone, thanks for having me this evening. So a bit of context on Clapton. We're 1,215 students, we're 11 to 19, so Key Stage 3, 4 and 5. We're a standalone academy, we're not part of a wider chain. We've been working for a long time on narrowing our sort of pupil premium and non-pupil premium gap, and have had real success with that. And I'm also now looking more at specific groups, including our Black Caribbean cohort, and in some year groups, our African Heritage cohort, but that varies year on year. I suppose the big bit of learning for me, or the big thing that we focus on as a school, is we're really trying to move away from the need for intervention. So really think about actually what needs to change about school to ensure that it's somewhere where everybody belongs. And that's what's really important for us, that every Clapton student, you know, feels that they're represented in the curriculum that's offered to them, and that they belong to our school and are proud of our school. And it's really thinking about how we manage that and actually what needs to change, because clearly there are all sorts of things that haven't quite worked with Clapton in schools generally, and it's about what needs to be different to actually make some of those things work far more effectively. One of the things I was asked to think about was some of the barriers that students are overcoming because of the gaps that have become established and some of the issues that our students face. So our girls obviously between 11 and 19, so these varies as they go up to school, but we've seen some really significant issues around that are sort of caused by poverty, but lots of things to do with housing, increasingly seeing students being pushed out of Hackney. So we've got students now coming back to us from Dagenham, Ilford, Romford, often in overcrowded housing, and have got lots of family responsibility because of the nature of parental work, so quite often looking after siblings into the evening, very early starts, and then there are all the issues that come from that. So, students arriving at school hungry, students without IT at home, and things that impact being able to come to school, like uniform not being clean, not having uniform, sort of food poverty. Attendance can be a significant issue for some groups. And also I think relationships with school, and understandably given some of the history we've heard about education and the way it's been for some families, obviously significant issues with trust in school and actually sort of recognising that things are beginning to shift and move. And I think particularly with girls, we're seeing growing issues around mental health, anxiety, some of that sort of starting with confidence and self-esteem, but then becoming far more significant issues. And lots of that's been exacerbated by COVID. So in terms of what we're doing as a school, obviously completely agree with Nicole that it's all about offering the highest quality teaching and learning to every student that comes through our door. But some of the other things that we've been beginning to look at as well. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a member of staff leading on equality and diversity and really thinking about how we raise awareness of the staff body, but also what needs to be different for students. So we've done lots of training around unconscious bias, cultural competency, really thinking about how we effectively diversify our curriculum. And there's been some real progress with that now, where we've got staff across the academy who've actually got appraisal objectives that are linked to this diversification, and really thinking about the texts that are available to students in English, the data they're studying in maths, the images that are being presented to them, and really giving them this exciting sort of dynamic offer that is reflective of the students we have. We've got recommended reading for staff, so we've had books that have kind of circulated the staff body that are recommended texts that we feel teachers need to have read to be able to teach effectively in Hackney, and that's moving more into now looking at recruitment and retention of staff and ensuring our staff body and our leadership team and our governing body reflect the diversity of the school. Also thinking about how HR policies and some of the softer things that happen within teams that can often make workplaces a challenge for members of staff from minority ethnic backgrounds, and really thinking about how we challenge that effectively and how we have these sort of difficult conversations as a staff body. For students, it's meant really getting them to think about what they need from the school. So we've made some practical changes to things like the uniform policy, with a big focus on hair and what the rules are about hairstyles and the way those things are worded. We've had some great celebrations of World Afro Day over the last few years, and I think really recognising the importance of some of these events within the curriculum to ensure that all students feel that sense of belonging and that sort of freedom to express themselves has been hugely important. And we've also looked a lot at leadership opportunities at a student level and making sure that we're checking the breakdown of students involved in debating, in different after-school clubs and the Duke of Edinburgh programme, to really make sure that we're challenging all students to engage in all aspects of school life. And then when they're not, looking at why that's happening and what we can do to intervene. In terms of teaching, really thinking about the best possible teaching. So lots of shared reading, lots of research, lots of support and coaching for staff, and an emphasis on constant development, that we need to constantly evolve and really improve and look at what's not working. I think there's a lot to be said for giving schools the money to ensure they can retain staff, but also that you can employ the most expensive staff. So I know there are schools in the position where they have to take NQTs when they have a vacancy. We're in the sort of strong position of being able to take the best teacher that applies, an interview, and really giving the girls those experienced teachers and leaders. We've done a lot of work on staff wellbeing, which I think can't be underestimated in terms of keeping teachers in schools long enough for them to actually build relationships with students and families. There's a lot to be said for having a consistent staff body in front of students. We've thought a lot about the timetable and the way we organise groups, lessons. We've done a lot of looking at sets and who gets moved up and down sets and why. We've introduced a lot more mixed ability teaching, and there's a far tighter process now if people actually want to move students, and really looking at the makeup of different groups. We've done a lot of work on this in maths, where we did notice there were some significant disparities. And over time, that's led to some really constructive conversations with staff, but also a lot more challenge about, well, actually, why are you moving that student? And what have you done to address some of the issues they are facing? Really looking at how we use support staff to intervene, particularly around attendance issues. And we do a lot of what can be quite time-consuming and deep work, trying to get to the bottom of what is causing non-attendance or what wider support students might need, rather than just trying to intervene with what might be a sort of short-term issue, and actually spending the time trying to work out where that issue has come from. We work with lots of other schools through the Hackney Teaching Schools Alliance, but also through our wider association with Pixel, which is a national organisation of schools. And they share lots of good practice specifically about intervention and how we can use that effectively. But we sort of divide students up into groups, look at which ones are making lots of effort but not making progress and why that might be, and vice versa. And where students are improving, making significant progress, having those conversations with them about what's brought about that change. I think another big thing is stopping gaps from growing. So really investing in Key Stage 2-3 transition and building really effective relationships with students and their families. Not underestimating the amount of information that you can get from a Year 6 teacher or the learning mentor that's been working with that student. And we start offering leadership opportunities from Year 7 to really try and get the girls to understand that they're all going to go out as sort of agents of change into society, and they need to be prepared to do that. I think other things that help are looking at restorative approaches to behaviour. I think that's often, if you take a sort of far more punitive approach, often where things can break down early on and then be very difficult to restore. A lot of work around multi-agency involvement and how you really effectively use support that is attached to families. We look at very early literacy and numeracy input in Year 7. Confidence building and relationship building, and the importance of sort of pastoral programmes in making students feel they are part of their class and sort of part of the Clapton team. COVID has really highlighted the IT divide, and I'm determined now that every student that joins us in Year 7 will have their own device to use at home. We're still working out how we're going to fund that year on year, but definitely hugely important. And really looking at other things that can get in the way of engaging with school. So, having to bring in food for food tech lessons and who's paying for that. And, some of them are very small things, but actually anything that gets in the way of engagement with school is hugely important. I was asked to think about sort of local authority support, and I think definitely around the IT and Wi-Fi, housing, rehousing, temporary housing. We've had to, really write letters on behalf of some families and get actively involved in trying to say this family's already been moved 3 times. You can't move a Year 11 student 20 miles away. That's not going to work. Food poverty, and really thinking about whether there's collective effort that can be made around that. Inclusion, and the greater that trust can be in all forms of authority within the borough, with the more the easier relationships between schools and parents will be. Funding has been raised by several people. I think that whole thing around multi-agency involvement and how we work together, and something that quite often comes up for us as a significant barrier, the students where we often don't quite manage to make it work, is ones who've moved school a lot. So I think any work that can be collectively done to avoid students attending 2, sometimes 3 secondary schools will have a big part to play in some of these students that do significantly underachieve. Sorry, lots of ideas there and whistled through, but yeah, they would be the key points I want to share.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate each of your contributions this evening. Really, really insightful and informative stuff, and really encouraging to hear all of the work that's being done to try and close the gap. As Professor Demie said, I think I tend to agree that it's easy. Well, I say it's easy. I'm not a teacher, but to raise attainment levels across the board. But actually, the most challenging thing is to close that gap. So wherever we have made any gains, it's really important for us to take note and to recognise that. So now moving on to questions and answers. We've now run over by 15 minutes, so I'd just like to ask members of the Commission and our guests to try and keep questions and answers as brief as possible, please. I'd just like to kick us off. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to this time because I've got some things I really want to say. And the first thing actually is aimed at Hackney Education, and that is about the data. I always seem to have a complaint about the data, but it would be quite useful if in future we could actually look at like for like. So instead of looking at all pupils versus, you know, Black Caribbean girls, Black Caribbean boys, it would be really useful for us to look at white British quite specifically, because that essentially is the baseline, isn't it, that everything is measured against. So it would be useful for us to see how that compares, because I would imagine that the all pupils is watered down to some extent by the underachievement of these other ethnic groups. So I just think it's important for us to ensure the data is as helpful for us as a Commission as possible. I'd then also I think it'd be really useful for us to see attainment breakdown by school, so that we can identify schools that are doing particularly well in this area, so that we can share best practice, so that we can look to these positive examples of our schools getting things right, and that we can dig a bit deeper into how they are approaching that. So that's just a contribution that I wanted to make to that. But actually, it would be useful if you're able to say whether you do have any outliers in that regard, if you have any schools that are outperforming others in terms of closing the gap, and if there are others that lag behind. I'd also like to know whether, and this is again to Hackney Education, whether the 7 main reasons identified for underachievement identified in Professor Demie's report are areas that we feel that we already have a grasp of, and if these are areas that I would expect that we do, because we have a similar ethnic makeup to schools in Lambeth. But yeah, I just wanted to know if these are all on our radar, and if we are confident that we are doing things to tackle each of these 7 areas. And just to remind you, that's poor leadership on equality issues, institutional racism, stereotyping, low expectations of teachers, curriculum barriers and relevance, lack of diversity in workforce, and lack of targeted support. So I'll just hand over to Hackney Education before going to the Commission for more questions.
Yes, I can answer some of those, Councillor Conway. I mean, it may be better to have the discussion about what data is presented in a separate meeting, because I think there is something that we're always pleased to celebrate, and indeed data is available publicly, but naming and shaming might not be what this is about. So I think probably something to explore separately. But of course, we do have schools that have particularly good practice, and we have some of our colleagues here who are presenting that. And Stephen talked about the school improvement partner process. Those colleagues are well aware of strengths and areas to ask questions about, and indeed narrowing the gaps is a focus for every discussion that they have with schools. So I can assure you of that is going on, and I'm more than happy to talk to you, possibly not in a public forum, about which schools we might have concerns about. But certainly we share that widely within the service. So I hope that's answered, or not quite answered, but said where we are with that particular question. The other points, we are aware of the things that Professor Demie talked about, and I think we are making progress with all of them. I think you've probably heard that in a range of the answers given. Orleen talked about the unconscious bias work and the input that she's had and we have had with policies around recruitment and retention. We sent those out to all schools about making sure we are inclusive. The work that Stephen talked about, Hackney has a huge culture of high expectations, which is very well thought of. And indeed, again, school improvement partners do tackle any areas where there might be seen as being low expectations. We've talked about, one of the things was about curriculum barriers and the inclusive curriculum. And I think we've heard about that and the work that's being done. We'd like to see it extended. And I was really interested in what Anna was saying about it being an appraisal objective for every member of staff, that they diversify the curriculum in what they do. So I think we are doing things, but potentially there's even more that we can do. Targeted intervention is absolutely part of practice in almost all Hackney schools. And I think Stephen talked about the funding we have for primary schools for Turkish Kurdish students and Caribbean students to support them where there is low attainment. That money has been given to schools to support targeted intervention. Although I think we would also say that that's part of what I would deem standard practice in our schools. And one of the things we talked about is ability grouping, which is more prevalent at secondary level than primary, although it does also happen at primary. And I think Anna gave said that there was a move away from doing so much ability grouping, and certainly we are seeing that in a number of different schools. So I think I would say that we are aware of those areas and have moved forward with them, and I think you would expect us to be aware of them. With some of them there is further to go, and I think that we have good implementation across the majority of schools, but we would like to see it being really strong across every school.
Thank you very much, Annie. Sorry, Anton, did you want to come in briefly, if you can, please?
Just to add to that, we're increasingly using our strongest practitioners to share their practice at various head teacher meetings and briefings at secondary heads, at primary heads. So it's a regular occurrence, or becoming a regular occurrence now, where people share their approaches. And one thing that we do know is that there isn't a single answer to this. So the more that people share, the more we learn from each other.
That's really encouraging, Anton, especially in light of what we've heard this evening from some of our head teachers in particular. Yes, can we move on to the Commission for questions now? So I will take questions in twos. Again, please be very brief and try to stick to one question, or do stick to one question, otherwise I probably will cut you off. So can we go with Councillor Hanson and then Councillor Etty, please?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to back you up on the stats point about comparing a group of people with the average. Just mathematically, that's not a good idea. So if you were comparing, I don't know, disabled citizens, you would compare them with non-disabled citizens, not with the average of all citizens, because mathematically that gives you more power. So just to say, there are scientific reasons as well as political reasons for saying we'd like to compare groups with each other, not with the average of a body of data that includes the group we're isolating. If you're really sad like me, I can show you some articles about this.
Okay. It's often what happens nationally, so I think we're reflecting what happens with national data and Ofsted, for instance. So I think that's what we're reflecting. But of course, we can get you the data separated as you've talked about.
That would be very helpful.
Doesn't mean it's right, Chair. I mean, if we are looking at gaps in achievement, the gap will be bigger if you compare, for example, Black Caribbean boys with a data set that excludes that group of people. So there may be good reasons why government want to compare it with the average, but statistically, it's actually quite a poor technique for reasons I could explain, but I won't for time.
Thank you, Councillor Hanson. Councillor Etty.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, firstly, I really have to say a big thank you to everyone that has spoken this evening. We've learned a lot, I mean, in various ways. Just a quick one. And I just, if we remember in 2019, I'm sure everyone that has spoken will remember what happened to Newham, the school in Newham, where they had 41 Oxbridge offers. And I'm just looking at that school and also looking at what is happening in Hackney. These are students that are mainly on free school meals, just as we have so many children here as well. Free school meals in terms of every other problems that we have mentioned or that they have talked about, stereotyping, racism, single parents, and all that. And yet, this student went ahead to have that fantastic. It was in the papers. We all saw it. And I'm thinking, I know we've done a lot in Hackney. There's been so much improvement, but it clearly tells me it's achievable. We can definitely still do better. And I just want to say, what more? What other strategies can we look into closing this attainment gap in schools? What other things do we have to look at? Are there other interventions, or what other things do we have to do, in closing this with regards to school? And I just wanted to pick on something. If you look at the report that was given, you have girls are doing much more better compared to boys. So if it is still the same girls that are in the same house, going through all these, having these disadvantages, and yet we have the boys in the same house, the girls are doing better, and the boys are still not doing better. So we really have to continue to look into what can we improve. Should we, one way or the other, hold, the schools? Do we have to hold the schools? Do we have to look into head teachers? Do we have to look deeply into, in terms of the workforce and all that in a realistical manner? What other approach do we sincerely have to look into? I commend every hard work, every work that has been done, because I know a lot has been put into this, seriously. And I really thank you all for that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm not sure who'd like to come in on this one.
I wondered if Mary might like to comment about the gender gap.
Yeah, unfortunately, actually, we've not done any analysis at national level of the gender gap, although we're certainly aware that for Black Caribbean boys in particular, attainment and exclusions are a particular problem. So I won't be able to comment hugely on that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. I think I just echo what Councillor Etty says, because, as somebody who's of Black Caribbean heritage, I have to say it does really grind my gears to keep hearing people referencing single parent families and a lack of, Black male role models and just the usual stuff that gets reeled out when we've got so many Black women doing so well who are coming from the same households. And I feel that I understand that there are gender disparities across the board, but I feel it's more pronounced when it comes to Black Caribbean children. And I believe, my personal sense is that that's Black boys' experiences of institutional racism are considerably different to that of the sisters. Sorry, Councillor Bramble, I think you wanted to come in there.
Just quickly, a few things, Chair. I'm just reflecting, seeing myself on screen in a way you don't normally, and I'm looking at my hair. So today it's natural, it's curly because I didn't blow dry it straight, and I reflect on, if I was a child in school, would I be one of those children at risk of exclusion because of the way that when my hair is not blow dry straight, there's a lot of volume. I'm just reflecting on that, Chair. I wanted to come in quickly to say that we're speaking a lot about single parent households, we're talking a lot about poverty, and while some of those things are what some of them are drivers, yes, it doesn't explain the disproportionality. So it's really important when we have this debate, we do not get caught up on single parent household and poverty, because there are children from white single parent households, there are children that are white from poorer backgrounds, and you don't see that disproportionate effect. So please, 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 let us just be comfortable about being uncomfortable about talking about race. We just have to get to that stage. I want to commend the work that the schools are doing, especially Clapton girls. I know they're doing lots of work, and I've spent a lot of time there and really championed the work that they're doing. Schools are embracing this, but we just have to be more comfortable about being uncomfortable talking about race, because it is a big issue. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think, Orleen, did you want to come in on that point? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, biggest faux pas again. I just wanted to reference research by Taki et al. That identifies that actually the three characteristics that mean that if you have these three characteristics, you face the biggest challenge in society, or you are the most pushed out. And those three characteristics are being from a lower socioeconomic background, being male, and being non-white. So actually, if you look at all of the research, most disadvantaged children fit into 2 or 3 of those characteristics. So that often explains the difference between male outcomes in comparison to female. It's much more about perception, society's perception of them. Black girls are not outperforming their peers, but it's about society's perception of those 3 characteristics, and being the most pushed out, it means they face the biggest barrier.
Thank you very much for that.
Chair, my question has not been answered. What are the priorities in terms of what priorities should inform the local authority, should inform us, in approaching and addressing this? I still have not had an answer, Chair. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Who would like to come in on that one?
I think maybe referencing part of what Professor Demie said about investment. And actually, he identified that government investment is really the way forward in terms of driving profound social change. So I think that's definitely something for us to think about in terms of moving forward, how we take this further into practice and policy, and considering the investment.
Can I just add there, as a council, you cannot do on your own. You don't have enough money, a big challenge in terms of closing the gap. One of the reasons why we're successful in London School long time ago, and I'm talking about 2010, we have so much money to invest to support schools and the community we serve. EMAG money, 80 million, even Black Carbon Achievement money we had. As a council, you could really try the best you could do. The challenge you are facing in terms of targeting intervention is really huge. Huge amount of investment is needed. What we need to do is convincing central government to invest, not only in the council, in local area, and in school. The other thing we really need to recognize from research we know now, we cannot talk always school and school. A school can only make in terms of achievement about 8 to 15%. And about 85% is done beyond the school gate. What it actually means is huge investment is needed beyond the school gate, which actually supports the school. We don't have that money at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Demie.
Councillor Conway, sorry, if I can just come back to Councillor Etty's question. On page 6 of the report, there's a list of key criteria that we expect to see in our schools, which are absolute priorities for us. But I think those are also further supplemented by some of the things that we've heard from Orleen and our colleagues in schools about the culture of inclusion, which I think is a real priority, and we're pushing very much across schools. And then I suppose linked with the culture of inclusion is reducing exclusions, which has also been a really high priority for us.
Thank you both. Can I take 2 questions from Councillor Gordon and then Councillor Shorhan, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. I do apologise. I'm afraid my camera's behaving erratically this evening, so I can't turn it on at the moment. Thank you very much for all the speakers. It's very helpful to hear about all this good practice, and I particularly single out congratulations to Orleen Badu and to Councillor Bramble in terms of the extraordinary reach of the curriculum project that they've been doing, which has gone, as I understand it, gone beyond Hackney. 2 very brief questions. They've got some overlap with what Councillor Ette was saying. I think these are probably aimed maybe firstly at Professor Demie. I entirely agree with you about what you've been saying. It's obviously no coincidence that this work has stalled or gone backwards because of the lack of investment since 2010 by central government in this area. However, I mean, I think we are where we are. I also obviously call for further investment from government as a priority in this. But is there anything else we can do as a local authority? Is it time to start setting targets, raw targets in terms of reducing this gap? Is that something that you think would be helpful? And the other thing I think maybe for Professor Demie and Mary is in relation, is there anything we can learn from the improvement of the achievement of the Bengali Bangladeshi community children in schools whose attainment gap has considerably decreased over the same period? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll also take a question from Councillor Shawan, please.
Okay, yeah. This is my question. There's been significant disruption to learning caused by lockdown and changes to in-class teaching and intervention. In this context, how do you stop underachieving children being drowned out, since most of the school population could be behind in their learning? And two, if you can answer, look into what do they call it? Looking into the future. When do you expect us to get back to normal? Like 2 years, 3 years, in terms of, intervention practices and everything? Thank you.
Stephen, do you want to answer the question about getting back to normal and maybe pick up on targets and their use?
Yeah, I think we're all hankering to get back to normal, that's for sure. But unfortunately, we're not quite sure we'll go back to the normal that we knew before. So what we do know is that from learning from the last time that children returned from the lockdown period, was that schools put in place baseline assessments and interventions to identify those who had fallen behind, and rather than just them assuming which children that would be or young people that would be, did a slightly more forensic analysis of which ones actually had not engaged as well with remote learning. And there's no doubt there's a percentage of pupils that are not engaging as well with that. But also adapting the curriculum to allow for all children just to recap on some of the basics, to allow them those building blocks and remind them of what they already know. So there's a huge amount of redrafting of schemes of work and assessment and so forth for schools to do, and it's no small undertaking to do that. But again, it comes down to that frontline teaching being very, very good and very effective, and schools making sure that those teachers really are at the top of their game. In terms of setting targets, we do ask schools to self-set targets each year, and we challenge where they're low. We also look at schools' data and look at the gap between the attainment of different groups, and we challenge schools where that isn't the case, where the gaps are growing or the gaps are larger than we'd expect. And those are professional conversations with the school, and highlighting those with the school in terms of saying, right, we can all see that this needs to change. What strategies are going to be put in place to narrow that gap and to show that difference? So we do follow a target setting process, but of course it needs to be bought into by the school, because the school is making the difference. And what our process is to challenge the schools that we think that ambition just isn't there, or just isn't evident enough in the target setting that's going on in the school.
Thank you. I think we had some questions for Professor Demie and Mary Reid from Councillor Gordon.
Yeah, I'll just come in on the issue that Councillor Gordon brings up about the improvement that Bengali and Bangladeshi students have seen over the last decade, and our data really bears that out. I think it's incredibly complex and difficult to isolate what has driven that, and there is a big academic literature that is inconclusive about what's happened there, but it further highlights the need to look at ethnicity as a really heterogeneous concept, and not see it as a black-white issue, but instead look by different ethnic groups in a really nuanced way. And also bear in mind that these ethnic groups have unique histories of migration and identity within the UK that will be partly what's driving what's going on. But one interesting aspect of that improvement is that Bangladeshi groups still have very high levels of child poverty. So it highlights that while socioeconomic status and poverty is a clear barrier to improving these gaps, that it can be done and these improvements can be made, which I think is a kind of hopeful note among much of the depressing outlook that I highlighted earlier.
Can I just, sorry, in terms of Bengali and a number of AL group in London, I do have really different argument why they really made huge improvement. In fact, one of the reasons why London made huge improvement was London school, London Headteacher really understand the AL population in terms of improving the level of fluency in English. Most of those kids are really very high aspiring in terms of education. Language was the main factor, problem, but with the support which the school are really giving extensively, they really manage actually to improve level of fluency in English. Once the level of fluency in English improve, including I'm talking about Bengali in Tower Hamlet, they are, those who are fully fluent in English, they really do better than white British really at the national level. So really the AL factor is there in London. We have huge number of AL, nearly about 47% or 50% of London population are AL. And that made huge difference. I would also argue one of the reasons why London improved is I think we have a huge number of AL children which really very high aspiring, and once the level of fluency improved, they really managed to improve and achieve high.
Thank you very much, both. I now have questions from Joe and Councillor Peters. Joe?
Thank you, Councillor Conway. I suppose I really wanted to ask what we could be doing further as a local authority to influence, nudge, support all schools, not only in terms of dealing, I'm thinking through the levers that we have are through influence largely, aren't they, but also through direct interventions with SIP partners. And clearly there's a lot of very focused work that goes on in those conversations with school improvement partners and schools. But I wonder, to what degree are they able to have those more nuanced conversations beyond levels of quality first teaching about the sort of culture of schools and some of the examples of really good practice that we've been hearing about this evening from some of the sort of representatives here, because it seems, well, I think it's very clear that it's a complex mix of all of those things that is required to make a difference. But it seems that the things that are coming through, the themes are around that sort of self-image, self-esteem, self-confidence, sense of identity. And we've had excellent work being done around the curriculum, but it needs to be done at so many levels and layers in schools. And I suppose my specific question is there more that we could be doing either via SIPs or through something like the charter that was mentioned by James Page and Haringey, sort of asking schools to sign up to a charter of very explicit commitments? You know, are there some more levers and drivers that we could put in place to accelerate the really good work that is already happening?
Answer to some of that, that's helpful. Annie, if that's okay. And certainly in terms of the SIP programme, those questions are being asked. So schools are being specifically asked, what work are you doing in terms of decolonizing your curriculum? What work are you doing to adopt anti-racist approaches? And I'm happy to say that schools are very actively engaged in this across Hackney. there's not one school in Hackney that doesn't recognise this as being something that involves them very intimately, involves their communities. So very much buying into that. And the effectiveness of the good to great policy and interventions over time have been well documented over the success story of education in Hackney, that results in the sort of 93% of schools that are good or better across Hackney. It should be 100%. That's something we need to get right. It's only 93%, but it's a high percentage. I think the work that we can do, that we can keep working on and improving on, is sharing best practice, building those platforms to share that best practice, and some of which you've heard today. Building on the work that we've been doing with the Young Black Men Project and with the unconscious bias training and so forth. All of that work that we do, which demonstrates how the pathways which schools can follow and the audit tools that schools can use to continue to improve their practice. There isn't a lack of will from schools in Hackney to improve. It's just about really showing them the way, and also supporting them and sharing where other schools are doing it well.
Thank you. So I have another question from Councillor Peters, and then I'll move on to Councillor Woodley, unless Councillor Woodley wanted to say something related to what Stephen has just come in on.
Sorry, Chair, I don't want to interrupt, but I've had my hand up for quite a while.
Oh, sorry, I haven't seen it. Okay, I'll go to you then, Councillor Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, I welcome everything we've heard tonight. It's been some really good practice, and I like the way the Professor keeps referring to the money that the last Labour government put into London's education that turned London round. And you know, I am here as a politician, so I do welcome that money that did come from a Labour government who recognised the problems that London was having in education, and certainly turned around Hackney's education. I'm perhaps one of the few people here to remember when Hackney's education wasn't as great as it is now, and parents were running away from Hackney rather than beating down the doors of our school to come in. That said, there's still the attainment gap between our black boys and young black men in relevance to other ethnic groups, and I do wonder. We heard about racism, poverty, disadvantagedness, but they apply to many ethnic groups, and including black girls who may be the sisters of the boys who are failing or not doing as well as their peers. What is it that we need to do to turn around the performance of our young black boys and men, so that they do as well as their white counterparts, and really sort of take their part in society? Because I think we are failing them still. We're doing better in Hackney than you are in the rest of the country, which is great, but they're still not doing as well as their white counterparts. So I've heard about lots of targets and all the rest of it, and lots of good practice. I wonder, when we talk to the Young Black Men's Project, what they say about why they think schools are failing, and also what parents think, because I haven't heard anything tonight about what the actual pupils think and about what parents think. I remember when my children were at primary school, they held a maths evening, and that got fathers involved. I'm not sure that all schools got all children have got fathers, but that certainly raised attainment in maths, because fathers hadn't seemed to think the school in that stage, and I'm going back 40 years, was their business. So I just wonder what we're actually doing to talk to families, children, pupils, and the community, and also what wider factors may affect, say, black young men, such as stop and search, who may affect our teenagers in the community, as well as what's going on at school.
Thanks, Councillor Patrick. And I know if I can say a couple of things, and then maybe bring in Orleen and possibly James, because I think James from Haringey did mention when they talk to pupils, two of the things that had come up that were important were their self-image and identity, and their relationships at school. And I think that's been echoed by some of the things our head teachers have talked about. And certainly it's some of the work that Orleen, in the training she does with schools, very much talks about how schools can ensure they are both promoting a really ambitious self-image for every child, but also avoiding the opposite. And I think that does come back to stop and search. That's also one of the things we've talked about with the Young Futures Commission, which we've been really keen to support the taking forward of the actions from the Young Futures Commission. Hackney Schools Group Board has also done some work talking to parents with school leaders, having discussions with parents about how they experience race in education. And I think that has been illuminating and moving, and we have got a publication on that on our website, which has been certainly shared across a number of London boroughs and has stimulated some others of our schools to get involved in those discussions. I'm going to bring Orleen in.
Thank you, Annie. I think thank you for your question, Councillor Patrick. I think a lot of the training and a lot of the premise around the Young Black Men's Project as well is very much about thinking about systemic inequality, and that so the issue is like Anna at Clapton Girls said, it's not about offering interventions solely, but it's about challenging the biased perceptions of this particular group, which is why you may see differences in outcomes for different groups, because actually largely a lot of the work is about challenging our perception of young black men and their capabilities, and their path, giving them pathway visioning. So I think I think a lot of that is about how we systemically work to remove the barriers that which sometimes are fueled by bias that we need to really unpick. I know James said he wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, just some brief points to add to that. I mean, on the people voice, I think it is really powerful. We haven't done enough yet on the people voice side, but it is really interesting, you know, to follow up in that way. And our next conference will be, you know, based around people voice and a lot of things. But I think, you know, the things that really came through, you know, just to elaborate on what those kind of areas are that Annie rightly pointed to. Firstly, there's what you bring to school as a child from the outside, what you bring to school, the perceptions, whether it's in the media, the stories that you're hearing, negative stories about, you know, whether it's crime or whether it's any number of things that you hear, particularly as a young black male growing up in society, and that has that kind of background effect walking into school. Then there was the expectations from teachers that felt like that was that it wasn't, I don't think they were getting at it being consciously racist, but that it was, you know, just the classic kind of, there were just lower expectations of young black men than others, and that kind of pervades expectations and reasons given for why they couldn't succeed versus other children who couldn't succeed. And then there was a really interesting point about leadership, which was this was a message aimed at head teachers in, you know, across the borough. That's what we were asking, and they were saying, look, we know you want to help, we hear it, you know, we get that you see that there's an issue and that you're kind of on our side, but you've got to prove it. You know, what is it that really is going to make us believe that you're behind us in a substantial way, not just kind of warm words, you know, and everything else. And it was a really good challenge, you know. So I think that was really kind of helpful as a set of steers. But interestingly, like I say, I'm not saying it's not important, but they didn't talk about the curriculum at all. And actually, there's a bit where when they were talking about, you know, I don't want teachers to have different or lower expectations for young black men, that it would, you know, need to be, you know, that they didn't want to have a different playing field. They wanted to have the same expectations as everyone else on the same playing field, which was quite interesting. Now, like I say, I'm not saying that changing the curriculum is not important. It's fundamental. But I think, you know, there's a kind of, you know, expectations, leadership, and proving that kind of support and backing for young black men, you know, maybe that comes immediately.
Thank you very much. So I've got James and Councillor Woodley. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to challenge you to try and get your questions and answers done before 9, please. And Councillor Peters.
This is picking up on Professor Demie's point about a lot needs to be done beyond the school gate. And Olivia, you mentioned the need for housing to be is an important part of helping disadvantaged children. Clearly, if you live in cramped accommodation, if you don't have space to work, if you don't have quiet, if you have if that results in poor quality sleep or disruption at home, if you're moving around, then I guess that can feed into poor educational achievement and performance. Now, while the council has limited scope to do a lot about the macro picture of the housing crisis, we do have lots of people in temporary accommodation, including children. We do have lots of people in overcrowded homes who won't be rehoused for a number of years, despite the council's best attempts to build a lot of as much social housing as we can. So I'll be interested in, I guess, probably Olivia and Nicole and Lisa and others' views on what their experience is like of dealing, well, their professional experience is like as educators of dealing with the council as a landlord for your pupils. And are there things that the council, as that landlord, should be doing better in order to support you as educators?
And before we take answers to that question, Councillor Woodley.
Thank you. I really appreciate this very specific focus of this evening. It's been really fascinating looking specifically at Black Caribbean children and young people and what we're doing in schools and across the council as well. I did want to say, though, that we can't really ignore the crossover with additional needs, particularly when we're looking at areas of unconscious bias and young Black men. And I do want to kind of give a bit of credit really to Elaine and the work that she's done with at Senko conference, for example, with that training, and what an impact that had actually on some of our Senkos and how they want to take some of that work forward in terms of recognizing that there is a major problem with communication at times and how that is interpreted when unconscious bias is not addressed. So I want to touch on that, but I think Councillor Peters has raised great questions and I want to allow time for a response to that. So it was really just to throw that in.
Can I just add, I'm just going to add one more question in, seeing as that wasn't a question from Councillor Woodley, and that is about us auditing our workforce and what is done to audit our workforce, diversity, leaders, governors, because we've heard that identified as more representative leadership as being one of the key factors in improving standards. And if we have audited our leaders, what do we look like? What does it look like in Hackney compared to other boroughs? And is there more work that we can do in that area? So Councillor Peters, response to Councillor Peters' question first.
I think that was a question for the head teachers about how their children experience housing issues. No,
yes, it was.
Do you want to start with the youngest children, Lisa?
Yes, we have lots of issues around housing locally to us. We certainly are being asked by parents to, provide letters in the same way that Alan was saying, letters to help them move out of what is really cramped accommodation. We have a lot of families in temporary accommodation and it's really, I think it is really impactful. We know that we've got families who have got a one-bedroom property with, 3 children in it, and certainly we would really help, to support that move. But then often parents are moving out of the local, out of Hackney, are unable to stay in the local area. So at times our population is quite transient in what we're sort of doing to with our families. So certainly we do experience it. We do have families that are really struggling in their accommodation, and really struggling with things like not having washing machines or things like that. And through the Children's Centre, we're certainly be able to go through certain routes to be able to provide some grants and different ways in which we can help families that might come through the Children's Centre, rather than and signposting through that way, and being able to support with the multi-agency team. So certainly housing really does have an impact on our very young children, and has a real impact, and we've noticed it with sort of in terms of mental health and well-being for our families who have really struggled with the housing that they have. And all we can do really, I think, is support that, whether that's with letters or whether that's supporting with being able to go through the routes of the Children's Centre and signposting our families on with that. And we certainly have done quite a lot of work with those families to provide things that they really need in terms of equipment and clothing and things like that.
Richard, did you want to come in on this one?
Yes, please. And obviously I'm a member of the Commission rather than a head teacher, particularly tonight. But in terms of New Regent's College, one of the clear characteristics of youngsters that have been permanently excluded is the number of times they have moved properties, which also, of course, has often caused multiple moves of schools. And equally, as a PRU, we're only allowed to have Hackney residents on roll. So we've also had situations where young people have gone out of the borough and so have gone off our roll and into a PRU of another borough. And then within 6 months or a year, they are back because they were in temporary accommodation to start with. And I would also say that with everything that's been going on with remote learning at the moment, it's obvious the number of families where if 2 different teachers or 3 different teachers are trying to deliver 3 different lessons, it's quite chaotic because the young people have not all got separate rooms they can be in, younger siblings as well. I think many teachers would say that the whole remote learning experience has actually drawn a sharp focus into the overcrowded nature of a lot of housing. I will say one really positive thing, because why not finish with a positive? Urswick has, I think, managed to close the digital divide largely in the last few weeks, because we've now given out about 400 devices. Now, they're not going to be collected back in at the end of this when they return to school. So, in fact, in optimistic terms, it may be that some of the work that has been done during remote learning will have a longer term impact, because those young people will have better IT at home than they would have had but for the pandemic. There we are. Found something positive to say about the pandemic.
Thank you very much. And can we have answer to the question on auditing the workforce diversity, please?
Yes, so I think Councillor Conway was talking about the schools workforce. We don't know about all schools, but we do have access to those who use our payroll overall. And what we do find is that it's not reflective of our pupil population. The support staff are much more so reflective of pupil population, and then there is a gradation through the levels of seniority. Although we've got excellent role models at head teacher and executive head teacher level of a diverse colleague from a diverse background. So it's not as reflective as we want it to be and are ambitious for it to be, and that some of the work that Orleen is doing and our HR team are doing really helping move forward approaches to that. I would also say that it does vary from school to school. So there are schools that are much more reflective of their population than others.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll have to draw this to a close now, and just to sort of summarise what I think we're hoping to do with this going forward. Obviously, Attainment comes to this commission every year, and I just think from what's emerged from this evening's meeting that we'll hopefully be able to, drill down into further detail when Attainment does come back to us, and to request data to be, presented if possible in a way that helps to illuminate the progress that's being made in terms of the attainment gaps that we've identified this evening, and others that we've also acknowledged from the data that we've seen. But also, I think what's been quite useful to hear is about the pledge in Haringey, actually, and it feels as though that's potentially something that we're missing in Hackney, is to be able to share that best practice across the board, some of the best practice that's clearly been identified by our schools this evening, and to be able to see if we can get the rest of our schools on board. I'm sure that they are in practice, but to be transparent in that pledge to utilising all the approaches that are open to them to reducing the gap. So I think that's about it. Also, actually, I wanted to make a point about exclusions, because we haven't mentioned exclusions and the role that they play, and disproportionality in exclusions and not being in school, I'm sure contributes a hell of a lot towards not doing well at school, because you can't, I think actually the digital divide is actually illuminated, or young people being educated at home has, and not being at school, I think has highlighted for many of us the implications of not being in school and for many children, and what that has meant. And I think for me, there's some parallels to be drawn with the experience of excluded pupils, or pupils who are in isolation within their schools. And I'd just like to say that we will be touching on this in our report, which will be soon to be published, the implications that school exclusions have on our pupils. So I'd like to now draw this item to a close. Thank you so much to everybody, in particular our guests this evening. I really appreciate it, and really encouraging to hear your contributions this evening. So now moving on to item 5, which is the work programme. The work programme for the remainder of the year is set out in the report. Due to rearrangement of the planned meeting in April to avoid mayoral elections, the next meeting of the Commission will be on May the 11th, 2021. During March and April, the Commission plans to conduct its planned review of adolescents entering care. The scope for this work is being drafted and finalised and will be sent to the Commission for comments. To support this review, 2 meetings will be held over March and April, and the Commission will be consulted for possible dates. Moving on to item 6, minutes of the last meeting. The minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of January are attached for the Commission to review. There are a number of actions arising from the meeting. The first is that City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership were asked to respond to additional questions due to the time limitations at the last meeting. Written responses are provided in the reports. The second is Hackney Education Service was requested to provide further information on demographics of those children in, what's EHE? Sorry, Martin.
Elective home education.
Elective home education, sorry. And the out of school project. A short brief has been provided. To flag 4.6 in the report, just 6% out of school settings have responded, possibly due to COVID. Possible further update for the Commission, hopefully. So can we note and agree the minutes of the meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 7, any other business? The date for the next meeting is the 11th of May 2021. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I shall hopefully see many of you on the 11th of May.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.